right. Here we go. So my topic today and what I've been invited to talk about by Joyce is Me Too, the Me Too movement, and an examination of Black women and sexual violence. I've been doing this work for approximately 20 years. Again, I work for the Coalition Against Sexual Assault, known as MNCASA, but a lot of my work has been centering and uplifting the voices of Black women in this movement. MNCASA has been around for about 45 years, really working towards providing support and services to programs that are first responders or providing direct service to victims and survivors. We provide advocacy to those programs. We do a lot of policy and system work, changing policies that are barriers and hinders our ability to seek justice in any way that we want to seek justice. We also provide some system change work around putting together multidisciplinary teams to address violence and sexual assault within communities. And so we have our hands into quite a bit of work. And right now, our prevention team is really focusing on and revamping the prevention work that we're doing and making sure that our work is more inclusive, and we're reaching out to BIPOC and communities and really thinking beyond where traditional prevention work has landed. This is me, a little blurry picture of me. I'm pretty sure I was about 4 or 5 years old, feeling myself in my superhero sweatshirt, a fall day. I am a survivor. I'm also a secondary survivor of violence and abuse, generational survivor as an African-American woman. And I grew up in the Twin City metro area in St. Paul. This was probably around the first time 2 things happened to me. It is the first time that I seen or witnessed violence within my home. My mom used to go out periodically with her friends, and I would go to a relative's house that also had daughters. And every time I would go to this relative's home, what in my community, what would happen, I would fall out. And that meant that I would fall on the floor and didn't want to go. And I didn't have the words to express what was going on. And so they thought, or in our terms now, they may have thought I had detachment or anxiety disorder. Something was going on. They would have labeled me with something. I would consistently do that. And what was happening was that I was going over there, and her husband played in a band, and he would come home at like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and he would wake us all up, and he would make us line us up and make us watch him beat her. And every time I went, I would think this is not going to happen this time, but every time it happened, without fail, it happened. And I had not experienced anything like that, and I didn't have the words to put to it. And one day I discovered those words. And I said, he beats her. And the room stopped. My mother stopped doing what she was doing, getting ready to go out with her friends. And she got on the phone. And I didn't have to go over there that night. And when the room stopped, I realized that I had found the words to express what was going on with me. And I said it 3 more times. He beats her, he beats her, he beats her. And I remember this clearly. And I was probably only 4 years old, but this imprinted in my mind, in my body, in my soul. I remember how it felt. I remembered where we were at. I remembered the smells of the moment, but I remember things that a 4-year-old probably wouldn't normally remember. And my mother got on the phone and she made a call and she called my uncle. I remember that as well. Now, he didn't come up missing. Well, not that type of family, but my relative ended up getting out of that relationship. I don't remember her being in that relationship after that. So it was the first time that I witnessed violence within my community and my home setting. At this age, this was also the first time that I was called nigger. And I remember that clearly as well. I was in classroom in the first kindergarten, first grade, and a boy in my class named Scott, he terrorized everyone. And I remember him clearly calling that in the hate, in the venom that he had. And I couldn't associate with that. I didn't know, it didn't resonate with me. All I knew is that he was angry for some reason. And I also remember that the school didn't have the wherewithal on how to handle that. And discipline and accountability for Scott came very slowly. But I do know that like his father was called in to the classroom at some point in time, but the behavior didn't stop. It continued. And that was kind of my intersectionality into things aren't necessarily safe and they're not okay. But I did learn from my community that I could tell and help would come. But I learned outside of my community, if I spoke up and tell, help might not necessarily come. Those were the two things that I remember most about that. But I stand here today on the shoulders of those who made a way for me. Again, some of the things that I might talk about may resonate with you or not resonate with you, but all of this is kind of intertwined, and the existence that Black women have as we walk through crime victims and experience things like trafficking and exploitation and intimate partner violence and sexual violence as well. But some of the things may be difficult for you to see and hear, but I promise I will lighten it up just a little bit and share cute pictures of myself, maybe a little bit more throughout this presentation. And as we talk about that, I want to put up a warning. There is some explicit content in this. You know, one of my professors, Professor Gibson, told me that I had to add a warning to this. I come from the hip hop generation, and I remember a time where we were, when labels were first put on music that said explicit content. So I chose this to as a warning that I will use today, but I want to make sure that you take care of yourself. I know that you've been talking through a lot of heavy topics today. It's the end of the day. It's the day before the weekend. So make sure that you take care of yourself. If you're familiar with Resmaa Menakem, he's an author, a Minnesota author. His book, My Grandmother's Hand, he talks about processing trauma. And he says, you know, the double P's, positive processing. So do something to refresh yourself, drink water, stretch, hum, do what you need to do. But I'm trying to, as I deal with my trauma, to process it positively. And I see Joyce, you came on. Are you guys having a hard time hearing me? Okay, all right, good. All right. Okay, last I want to say, love yourself today. Do whatever you need, again, to be okay. And I will move into my presentation. The objectives today is to examine the intersectionality of sexual violence, review history, data, community impact, review system change and community healing opportunities for us to be better, do better, show up better. My next slide is Ms. Kimberly Crenshaw, and I'm going to stop my share because hopefully I can share a video with you. So let's hold on to my tech skills and see if we can make this happen. Do advanced sharing. And I swear I had it ready and up to go, and now I don't see it. Try it again. All right, can you guys see my screen, Joyce, with the video? Okay, can you hear it?
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance, sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white, and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, Black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism, and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism, and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and center the voices and work of marginalized individuals.
Okay. And so, again, Dr. Crenshaw coined the phrase intersectionality. It is so important for us to recognize that specifically when we're talking about crime victim services as well. And I will share again. Excuse me for the delay. There we go. 1 second here. I don't got everything I need going. Okay. I'm going to stop my share real quick and reshare. Here we go. There we go. And so as we talk about crime victim services and intersectionality and really bringing in and centering BIPOC folks and brown and Black folks in this work, it's important for us to understand that concept that when sexual violence occurs, when intimate partner violence occurs, there's a lot of other barriers that BIPOC folks face. For example, if there is a Black woman, and we've had these examples here in Minnesota, that maybe experience intimate partner violence, her first response may not be to call law enforcement, because that brings a whole nother aspect to the equation. It may be that I want the abuse to stop, that I want the harm not to happen, but I don't necessarily want this person dead. And if I call law enforcement, that may happen if the person that is harming me is a person of color, or if it's a Black male specifically. And so also, one of the other things that we hear is that people, Black women, fear getting their children taken away. So if I had the system involved in this situation, I might get my children taken away. And we know that the data shows that Black and brown folks are overrepresented in our child protection system. And so that's how some of this intersectionality works when you're working in crime victim service area. My next person, this is Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. She is the person that really coined and produced the conception around organizational trauma. And this is something that she was working on to develop a stronger understanding of why life for so many Indigenous people were not fulfilling the American dream, or what the American dream may look like. And historical trauma is trauma upon trauma that occurs in history to a specific group of people, causing emotional and mental wounding, both during their lives and the generations before and the generations follow. Using research from Holocaust survivors, Dr. Yellowhorse Braveheart compared a cluster of events that correlated with massive group trauma across generations for Indigenous people. That included the Wounded Knee Massacre. It focused on the forced removal of children to federal boarding schools, the public execution of 38 Dakota Indigenous people by the federal authorities in Mankato, Minnesota. And so she looked at these events and was tracking the historical trauma, the impact, the harms and the response to those harms across different generations. And then we have Dr. Joy DeGruy, who talks about the post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she specifically addresses the massive trauma that has been experienced by African-American people through her theory of post-traumatic slave syndrome. She did 12 years of study and research and examined the transgenerational adaptation of behaviors over centuries in order to survive. Survive the enslavement, survive Jim Crow laws, survive mass incarceration. So really taking a look at that and those things, but we could go on. We could talk about the medical assaults on Black folks with the Tuskegee Institute, the police murders. We can talk about workplace discrimination, system oppressions. So she took a look at all of those things and really did a good job in outlining that and then talking about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And an example of that she uses is like two mothers are talking, one is Black, one is white, they're at school, and the white mother is talking about the success with pride about her child's accomplishments. And the Black mother, she says to her, hey, but your child is doing well in school too. I noticed that they received a couple of awards last week, and what the Black mother says is that plays it down. Oh, well, they do good in school, but that child is a problem at home. We can't get them to do what they need to do. And one of the reasons that happens is that it is a protective factor. If you are trying to protect your children in a situation like Jim Crow, or if you are an enslaved person on a plantation and the master walks through and takes notice of your daughter and says, oh, it looks like she's coming along kind of fine right there. To protect their daughter, the mother may say, hey, she's not ready yet. She's not doing well. She may look good over here, but something's wrong with that child. We just haven't figured it out yet. Those are protective factors. Don't bring too much attention or too much focus on your child because something bad might happen. They may become a target of hate. They may become a target of opposition. And so those are some of the things that Dr. Degree would call the residue of, and sometimes we mistake it as culture. And so along with some maladaptive responses to enslavement and trauma, we also have passed down the legacy of resiliency and other skills as well that continues to help us thrive and make it through. Last thing, I'll talk a little bit about epigenetics, and this is how the experience of previous generations can affect who we are. And so there is a DNA coding of certain circumstances like trauma can cause our genes to be silent, or they can also cause our genes to wake up. There was a study that indicated that some of these epigenetic changes can be inherited through generations, called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And how I describe it in my layperson's term is that, example, you're working on an Excel spreadsheet and you keep on using that spreadsheet over and over again. That's your template. But at some point in time, what happens is that when you hit or try to enter certain information, what you get is all the symbols, or sometimes what we get is what we call the cuss words that come across your spreadsheet. And it is that something happened within that spreadsheet that interrupted the coding. Now you can go back in there sometimes and fix it. Sometimes without a special expertise, you're unable to fix it. It might be resistant to reprogramming. But this is the same thing that they're saying that could happen to our genes, that it spread generationally. It doesn't necessarily change our DNA, but it may change our genetics and how we read the coding. And in the Emory University, they did something to test out this theory around the coding. And so they had a cherry blossom study. They took mice and they pumped in cherry blossom smell into their container. And then at the same time they pumped in the cherry blossom smell, they would pump in a shock. And then they found out 3 generations later, if they just pumped in the smell without the shock treatment, their mice would have the same response as if they were pumping in the electric shock. And so just understanding that our genetics, there is some environmental causes, but our genetics actually can store and trauma within our bodies and throughout generations. And the racialized sexual exploitation of Black women developed during slavery and colonization impacts culture expectations and beliefs about the availability and the use of Black women and children for commercial sex today. It hasn't changed. In fact, sex trafficking of minors remains a major and persistent part of the epidemic of human trafficking in the United States. And I will walk through a little bit of the history. So right here we have the Ghana slave castles. Sexual exploitation has been historical violence against Black women. It was normalized through the colonizers to the extent that victimization of Black women wasn't considered real violence. Black women could not be victimized, or they weren't the perfect victim, as we see play out today. They were not believed. And as we look at this picture of the slave castle, in the middle was the governor's residence. And when they went back and looked at these slave castles, sometimes called the point of no return, they found that the governor's mansion actually, or housing actually had tunnels that went directly to the women's quarters. Now, as we talk about this, we would be remiss to say that we know that there were males and men that were raped as well. We can't go through and be have this illusion that that didn't happen, because when you are portraying crimes against folks, it's quite often, and even still now in war, torture happens through rape as well. If some of you haven't seen this before, this is the transatlantic slave trade. This is people, human beings. My ancestors were treated as cargo, and they were actually stacked as cargo. There were victims of sexual abuse, from harassment through breeding, rape, forced prostitution. The sailors on the slave ships, they were raped by overseer slaveholders, and this was a persistent threat against Black folks, the Africans that were came over in chattel slavery to the U.S. And this persistence abuse of brown and Black folks continue to happen today. It is a way of asserting power. It is a way of demeaning a community and folks, but also in these situations with enslaved folks, that brothers, husbands, sisters, mothers could not help and defend and fight off all of the attacks that were coming abundantly. And we know that there was definitely resistance. These were not passive folks that let these things happen to them, but they were overpowered. There was resistance, there was fight back. So I don't want to give the illusion that folks did not fight back or did not resist, but they were just overpowered at some point in time. These are not just the stories that were told through people that were enslaved, but the sailors told the stories. The captains of the ships actually told these stories. Other traders told these stories. This is well documented. It's not anecdotal. These are facts that cannot be changed with a softer telling of the atrocities that happened. Overall, the sexual abuse of women was part of a larger attempt to demoralize and gain submission over an entire community. Slavery did not recognize the sanctity of marriage, couples, families, any of those things. And I want to really iterate that enslaved people were not slaves most of the time when they were brought to the US. They were mothers, they were sisters, they were brothers, they were doctors, healthcare providers, healers, nurturers, accountants. These were a community of folks that had their own system of living and brought a history of that with them to America. As we talk about chattel slavery, through 1619 to 1865, Black folks were considered personal property. They were bought and sold as commodity, very similar to cattle. In 1808, importing Africans as slaves was banned, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen, just like other banned things. It was illegal, but it still happened, and there were still people that were brought over from the continent here. My family is originally from Virginia. That's where I can trace my family back to. And Virginia commodity at that time was breeding farms. As slavery grew, so did the price of enslaved people. Bancroft estimates that in the mid-1800s, enslaved people that were labeled as superior or excellent chattel commanded between $1,000 per person. That right now, I'm estimating that that would just probably be $80,000 to $90,000 per person. Enslaved women is well documented, as I stated, that white women were far from passive bystanders in the business of slavery. As previous historians have argued that they also were treated as second-class folks. We know that they had an active participation and shoring up their economic power through owning and ownership of enslaved people. Competing narratives about enslaved women. We had enslaved women, they were known as mammies and asexual. And at the same time, when they were being raped by folks, they were known as Jezebels and loose women, and there was something about them that was irresistible, and that the people that the rapists couldn't resist. And so there were always these competing narratives about Black women: undesirable, ugly, nobody wants them. The goal would to be embodied white women, and at the same time, they were sexy, irresistible as well. The Dred Scott case that happened in Congress right here in Minnesota tried to, did not have, Congress stated at that time that we did not have the right to ban slavery in slave states. Dred Scott was an enslaved person here in Minnesota. Minnesota was a free state, and when he traveled back to his home state and the person that owned him died, he was fighting for his freedom and said, I was in a free state. I spent most of my time there, and I should be free now. And he had documentation and the law behind him that said that. And there was finally a Supreme Court ruling that said he was 3/5 of a person and could not be free. And most of the time through that process of making sure that we were not seen as human, the assaults on women, children, and men to continue to happen, the attacks on us continue to happen. Then we move into the Jim Crow era, 1865, the 13th Amendment to abolish both slavery and involuntary servitude, except for punishment of a crime. I know that you guys have heard this. That was very important because prior to that, we hardly seen any brown and Black folks that were in prison after the freeing of enslaved folks. We seen the rates of imprisonment increase. And we had convict leasing that came out of that. So they would make up things that would happen. And again, prior to that, there was hardly any lynchings as well, because it was property, people were property and they were valuable. And so lynchings also increased in southern states. They said in 1882 to 1964, in southern states, at least 5,000 folks were lynched. And then there was 219 in northern states. Those were just folks that we know, that we can track. That doesn't track everything. And the number one reason that Black men were lynched was because there was a thought that they were getting beyond themselves. They thought too much of themselves. They were gaining too much access to power, finance, and control. But the excuse that was used to lynch Black men and women is that they were often accused of raping white women. That's how, and raping white women, looking at them, talking to them was an excuse. So between 1880 and 1930, close to 200 women were murdered and lynched. And quite often they were lynched if they couldn't find the man that they were looking for in the household, they would lynch the women. But they would also lynch the women if she had the audacity to accuse a white man of raping her. And so in 1855, a 19-year-old enslaved Black woman named Cecilia, she killed a white man who owned her and he was trying to rape her. Missouri law allowed a woman to use force at that time if she was in imminent danger or being forced into sexual intercourse. But the judge ruled that an enslaved woman had no right to refuse her master. Cecilia was convicted of murder and sentenced to death and hanged on December 21st, 1855. This is a story about Recy Taylor. These are two documentaries if you haven't seen them yet. Recy Taylor, the documentary, and then the new Rosa Parks documentary. Rosa Parks is my Shiro. We would hear the story of Rosa Parks as being a seamstress, or how it was told to me in school, that was just too tired to get up from her seat on the bus. And she refused that one day, but that's not true. Rosa Parks was a strategic, integral part of the civil rights movement. Prior to that day that she decided not to get up on the bus, she was interviewing women that were assaulted in the Deep South. And one of those women was Recy Taylor. Recy Taylor was a 26-year-old young mother on her way back home from church. She did all the protective things that we said to do: walk in a group, don't be alone. Well, a group of young white men came and snatched her, raped her, tore her clothes off, and then left her in the middle of town, butt naked, in a ditch. And her father went out with his gun to find her, and he found her. They admitted to sexually assaulting her and was not prosecuted. Rosa Parks and her team that was working with the NAACP, who was bringing these cases to the forefront, went to her house in the Deep South and was taking her testimony about what happened to her so they could raise these cases. And Rosa Parks went to several houses. The sheriff came, dragged her out the house, kicked her out, told her that we didn't want you here. And she left for that day and continued to go back. The other story about Rosa Parks is that Rosa Parks didn't get up that day from that seat because there was another young woman prior to that who did not get up. And she was they said that she wasn't a good witness, that she was too dark-skinned, that she was rebellious, and she wouldn't do well. And so Rosa said, I'll take the charge next time, and did not get up. So Rosa Parks, one of my sheroes, one of the first sexual assault investigators seeking justice and demanding rights for Black women that had experienced assault. Then we'll talk about forced migration. You might hear it as the Great Migration, people from 1880 to 1930s, moving to the North for better jobs. And what we found out here, that there might have been some opportunities, but the cost was high as well. We've seen women trading sex to make ends meet. We've had folks that really talked about the social service system in order to get financial assistance, or what we call welfare. You could not have men in your home or on the property as well. And so a lot of things happened in that forced migration, and things didn't go as well as people expected when they moved from the South, but they were forced. There was the Ku Klux Klan. We had things that happened like Rosewood. And so people were moving north from the South in order to survive, escape the terroristic measures that were occurring in the South. And then, of course, everyone strives to have a better quality of life. And you guys may have to time me because I don't have a good clock right next to me. This is a picture of lynching. Lynching was not a private 3 or 4 people showed up. There is documentation that when a lynching happened, there could be 10,000 people that showed up. They wore their Sunday best. It was like a championship football, baseball event. And then not only would they murder folks, then they would dismember them and take some of their body parts as momentum from that horrific event. There were postcards that were sent out to folks. There were pictures that were sent out to folks. This is a mob. And I remember going back to work after the December 6th Capitol fiasco, whatever you want to call it, January 6th, my fault, Capitol fiasco. And I said to my staff, that is the same venom. I recognize that hate when little kids were trying to go to school, when people were lynched. This is not something that we can take lightly, because my ancestors had prepared me for this. They showed me this. This is the same hate in the venom as they were marching across the Edward Pettus Bridge. Same hate, same venom. 2022 or 2020, 2016, whenever, it's the same thing. So we cannot turn our cheek, rise above it. We have to address these things when it happens, because these are the same patterns, the same examples, the same rhetoric, just dressed up and said in a different way. We have some of our Generation X folks. This was the generation pre and post crack era, overrepresentation in social service systems, criminalizing victimization, as we often see with Black women when they speak up about their victimization. We talk about the glamorization of sexual violence against brown and Black folks. Again, we continue to see the criminalization of victims, the normalization of violence against non-binary, transgender, and gender non-conforming women. Heard a lot about that in the George Floyd protests, that brown and Black, non-binary, gender non-conforming folks were experiencing a lot of violence and sexual hate speech towards them as well. Again, continue representation, overrepresentation in systems. I often call that I have data fatigue at times when I'm in presentations or working with folks or in the academic world, and I'm always hearing about health disparities, overrepresentation. I often say, I can see things in that data that other people don't see or not accustomed to seeing. For an example, when I was working at Hennepin County and we were talking about child protection, and they were talking about Black girls were #1 runners from placement. And I was like, and are we sure that they're running from placement, or are you sure they're being lured out of placement? If we talk about sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, is that happening in these situations? So when I see data, I look at data a little bit different when we're talking about my community and my folks. Community violence and victimization as well. And then the social media has added a whole nother layer of harm to Brown and Black women. And I have a little bit of data as I was talking about data fatigue, and I'll just go over it quickly. 2012, the US Department of Justice reported that 62% of human trafficking victims, including both children and adults, are African American. Additionally, African American children make up 52% of all juvenile prostitution arrests. Now in Minnesota, we have the safe harbor law, and we have deemed that people that are juveniles cannot be arrested for prostitution. You can't have a sexually exploited youth that needs services and also have a youth that we're going to arrest for prostitution. And so we pulled that factor out, that juveniles will not be arrested and are folks that need support and services here in Minnesota. And as we talk about safe harbor, here's some numbers. And we can talk about greater Minnesota or southern Minnesota. We just know that folks that are Brown and Black are being sexually exploited and trafficked in most of the communities across our state of Minnesota. I highlighted the African American and African or identify as Black because that tells a story within itself that in greater Minnesota, there's 16% of all safe harbor cases for trafficked youth were identified as African American or Black. And I'm sure the community and the population, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it's probably maybe 2%, 1%, 0.3%. I'm not exactly sure, but it's definitely not 16%. And then the other thing when we talk about data, we have to look at this as well. We have this multiracial category, and we need to look at that because if we look at those numbers, they're high as well. And we have to wonder how many people within that multiracial category, although they listed more than one race or ethnic identity, they still might identify as Black. And so we have more people than we think we do that are identifying as Black folks in these different categories. Black women reporting crimes of sexual violence. Again, we're less likely to seek help from law enforcement for many reasons. Women of color do not live in a silo solely defined by their gender. We've already talked about intersectionality. Therefore, issues of mass incarceration, system failures influence our ability to report our victimization. Commitment to our community and family. We don't have time to be victims. We need to move on, do what needs to be done. And re-victimization and criminalization of victims and survivors as well limit our ability to report or to seek justice or resolve to crimes and harms that we have faced. This is a young woman named Toya Brown. And I'm going to talk about her a little bit, but there are how do I even start this? I'll talk about her a little bit and then go into my conversation about adultification. So she was 16-year old. She was sentenced to life in prison for the murdering of 43-year-old Johnny Allen, who she shot in the back of the head while they were in bed together. So she was 16, he was 43. She explained she thought her life was over, that it was in jeopardy. She had been trafficked for many years, and they didn't take that into consideration. There's also some thoughts that she had some development delay. She had been in the foster care system for a while, may have been on the spectrum of fetal alcohol syndrome, but none of those things were taken into account of. This is what she looked like when she was sentenced to the murder of Johnny Allen, who she thought was going to take her life at that time. And one of the things that we find with Black women is that there is some indication that Black women are or Black girls are subjected to adultification. There is several factors that contribute to that. Negative stereotypes about Black women and girls, racism, sexism, poverty. Georgetown Law Center on Poverty really shares some insights and recommendations around Black girls and the topic of adultification. Adultification is a bias. It's the perception that Black girls are less innocent, more adult-like than their white peers of the same age. The publication also, I think this was issued in 2017, called Girlhood Interrupted. They examine the ramifications of adultification bias. And one of the things that they studied and they looked at was this fundamental question about the views of Black girls and white girls across the age groups of 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and 15 to 19 years old. These questions were intended to measure the perception or the innocence of these age groups. And they asked, do Black girls or white girls, depending on what group they were looking at, need comforting? Do Black girls or white girls need protection? At the age of 5 to 9 years old, the study group said Black girls do not need protection. They were often looked as more adult-like, stronger, could take care of themselves, when in reverse, the white girls were looked like they're innocent, they need help, they need protection, never were adultified in those conversations. This is just another story, sexual abuse prison pipeline. The girl story, I would recommend that as a reference as well. And then as we talk about this within the Black community, Black women tend to feel obligated to put race ahead of sex bias issues. We looked at it as our race first, women second. Jennifer Gomez created this theory called cultural betrayal theory. And the general ideal of cultural betrayal theory is that some groups develop this as an intercultural trust. There's love, there's loyalty, there's attachment, there's connection. For Black women, there's a lot of responsibility and solidarity to protect our community, to protect our Black men, brothers, to protect our children against a hostile society. One of young women that were victimized, they reported, 80% of young women that were victimized reported at least one form of intercultural pressure. That included and suggested that they had to be in solidarity with their community and their perpetrator, and they could not talk about harms, specifically rape. An example of that could be that a Black woman that was raped by a Black man was told by either the police or her community that she should not, her charges of this would not be taken seriously. Within community, a lot of times we talk about it will make Black people look bad, or we carry the weight of our community when something happens within our community. So I'm going to go to this topic about, we have two men here. We have R. Kelly and Bill Cosby, and many Black people or Black communities feel like highlighting these high profile cases like R. Kelly, Ray Rice, Bill Cosby as a tactic to minimize Black men. There was some conversations about Bill Cosby was getting ready to buy NBC, and that's why these allegations were coming up against him. We also think it's an effort to Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young Black man. I think there's the story of his mother is out in theaters now. Young man from Chicago went to the South to visit family. False allegations that he looked, whistled, said something inappropriate to a Black woman, and he was killed. He was murdered and thrown in the river with cotton gin tied around him, hoping that people wouldn't find his body. And so sometimes we talk about Emmett Tilling a person. We don't always trust mainstream media. As well, we have reasons not to trust media. We have reasons not to trust law enforcement to be telling the truth. We have centuries of things like this happening to us. So there's reasons why we don't trust when we hear about things happening to Black men in our community, and we feel responsible for protecting them as well. But there has been centuries of hiding and purchasing and abuse of Black bodies by white men, and women placing the blame back on our community. It is your fault of your victimization. And our trauma response to protect our men at all costs, to protect our community at all costs. And so we may be slower to believe what is happening in the media, but we have some Black women that really stood up and took the charge in this. And these are the women that did that to bring the things that were happening into fruition. We have Dreen Hampton, Tamara Simmons, Bree Bryant, who did the work around bringing through video, bringing the story about R. Kelly. Tarana Burks was a part of that, and Miss O'Dellaway and Miss Barnes as well was very instrumental in bringing to light the things that were happening about Bill Cosby. But it's complex. People grew up with R. Kelly. They also grew up with Bill Cosby. And at times, they also contribute to our community. But they also, we do recognize, and we have to recognize that they also have done egregious harm to Black women in our community as well. And as the healing process, we have to talk through and heal as a community and stop giving folks passes when they do harm to Black women as well. So part of that healing looks like addressing our racism, sexism, and victimization within our Black community. It's hard, but it is necessary because it prevents survivors from getting the help that they need and from our community healing as a whole. Factors that impact our healing are community beliefs and myths about things like sexual assault, sex trafficking. I would always say, you know, I just never seen a 9-year-old girl that was fast, as we would call in my community, that had not been violated in some type of way, and talking about that differently, and stop saying and asking folks what happened to you, and not what's wrong with you. Strong cultural stigma attached to mental health, illness, and trauma. I do see the trend changing in that distrust of institutions and police, rightfully so. Loyalty to community and family, protecting Black women. There's religious beliefs as well. There are white racial constructs of what family looks like, micro and macro aggressions that people experience when they're trying to heal, lack of culturally responsive services and research, lack of community awareness and education, and not being heard, listened, felt to be invisible, and our experiences being erased as well. How do we reduce violence against Black women? Improve our data collection. Let's know what we don't know. There is a specific task force, a legislative mandated task force right now that we're working on that is looking at murdered and missing African-American women nationwide. We have 65,000 Black women that are missing, Black women and girls that are missing, and we hardly hear those stories, as well as we have Black men and boys missing as well. We need to address racism, discrimination, and cultural insensitivity among service providers, systems, and law enforcement. I often tell my staff, if we are privileged to be at that table, then we have the ethical responsibility to speak up against these things and put systems in place to make sure that they're changing. Allies step up and pull back when necessary, create spaces for all voices, organizations asking you to incorporate in your strategic plan and your logic models and programs, employment development plans based on anti-oppressive practices. I went through a strategic planning with my organization, and the facilitator and a board member said, you know, if you have racial justice as a focus of your direction, your strategic direction, you got to do some work on it. And that's the whole point. That's why it is a focus on our strategic direction. Provide services and treatment for Black victims and survivors to address disparities that ensure Black participants in your programs and your services receive quality care. Now, if you, for an example, if you are working with a young Black woman that is pregnant, we know that disparities in infant mortality rates and surviving pregnancy for Black women are low. You are ethically obligated to ask her questions and see if she needs any resources regarding that. Recruit and create work environments that are sustainable for Black staff. What I hear from our advocates and our staff is that their white colleagues are often comfortable and want to work with BIPOC, Black, and Indigenous participants in their programs, but have a hard time taking direction from Black and Brown leadership and colleagues as well. You got to do work on that area. You can't be down for the cause if you are not willing to reflect and examine how you are showing up in spaces with your colleagues. Allies acknowledge sexual assault is not only a gendered issue, but is also an economic, oppressive, and racialized issue. I think I just got a couple more slides. Meeting the challenge, creating opportunities to involve Black institutions in your discussions, in your planning. Survivor leadership is imperative for good programming and peer-to-peer education. Again, anti-racism strategies, directions, and values. Support your Black leadership and understand and know what that means, and advocate for law and policies that support BIPOC victims and survivors. And we have Miss Tarana Burks here. When you truly empathize with someone, you have to take into account all things that make that person who they are. In essence, you are seeing the humanity in that person. And Finally, I am Artika Chevelle Roller. If you have any questions or want to reach out to me, same as Joyce did, please do not hesitate. Here is my contact information. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much for your time today, Artika. That was all such good information. Selfishly, you already know I've seen the presentation and I love it. So
Well, thank you for the invitation, Joyce. I'm glad that I was able to be here with you today for your